In the Kelsey Brothers Super Bowl, it was Travis who won with Kansas City, but the real winner was Cleveland Heights, which spent 2 weeks in the national spotlight because of the first time two brothers faced each other. It's Today in Ohio, the news podcast discussion from cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer. I'm Chris Quinn. I'm here with Lisa Garvin, Laura Johnston, and Layla Tassi. It's a Monday, lots of big stuff to talk about, but let's start with something light. To begin, Jake Paul is a greater Cleveland celebrity involved in multiple platforms, and now he's getting into gambling. Laura Mark-Bona had a long chat with him. What's the gambling endeavor?
It's a gambling sports book that is meant for millennials, basically, and that it's focusing on micro betting. So those moments in the game, you're like, what's going to happen next? And betting on that in-game wagers, the outcome of the next play, pitch, or shot. It sets deposit limits for users between the ages of 21 and 25, and it became the first mobile sports book to ban credit cards and allows only prepaid cards or debit cards. So the idea is you can't get into that much trouble. You can only spend the money that you have. So this is an app he co-founded with Joey Levy, and it's part of this onslaught of sports books that launched in Ohio as soon as it was legal on January 1st of this year. And as we know, we've talked about on this podcast, sports gambling is very popular in Ohio. So he says it's been really successful so far. I mean, this guy is 26 years old. He's a Westlake native, a boxer, the head of fighter advocacy for a division of the Professional Fighters League. He's a venture capitalist and a YouTube celebrity, a TikTok personality, and obviously he's a businessman. So his gambling app is called Better, B-E-T-R.
Yeah, he's had some controversy, but you got to salute him. I mean, he's got his hands in a lot of tills. He's a remarkable entrepreneur.
Yeah, I am impressed at 26, right? And to think, okay, I want to do a sports book, but I want to do it a little bit differently. The focus is just on the big ones, the NFL, the NBA, MLB, NCAA. And while he's doing this, he's preparing for a big fight against Tommy Fury in Saudi Arabia on February 26th. And 22 million followers on Instagram, 20 million on YouTube, 17 million on TikTok. This is a massive platform.
Yeah. And what was nice about the display in the Plain Dealer, they had 4 different pictures of him from different parts of his life because he does just have so many things going on. Check out Mark Bona's story. It's on cleveland.com, and you're listening to Today in Ohio. All right, Lisa, let's go there. How was First Energy like an octopus?
It had tentacles everywhere in Ohio, from the Public Utilities Commission to the General Assembly and to the governor's office. And I had to figure out how I was going to tell this story today. So I think I'm going to do it as a timeline because all the pieces kind of fit together. And this is all from 9 days of testimony from lead FBI agent Blaine Wetzel. And he started back in 2016. So 2016, First Energy was looking for a legislative solution to their nuclear plants, which were failing financially. January 2017, Larry Householder flies to the Trump inauguration on a First Energy jet, and he has many dinners with executives and lobbyist Jeff Longstreth while he's in D.C. In February of 2017, Longstreth signed off on establishing the Generation Now nonprofit, and then also lobbyist Dan McCarthy started a similar nonprofit dark money thing called Partners for Progress. Now, Dan McCarthy later became Governor Mike DeWine's legislative director. So starting in 2017 and through 2018, $2.4 million flowed from First Energy to these nonprofits for staff, ads, and so on and so forth. And their goal was to get Householder elected as House Speaker, and they wanted to back candidates who would also vote for Householder as Speaker. In March 2018, First Energy declares bankruptcy. The nuke plants are losing money, and the first known draft of House Bill 6 was generated by First Energy Solutions executive David Griffin, and it was circulated among other executives later in that year. And then in April 2019, a bill sponsored by 2 House GOP members, the bill that became House Bill 6, First Energy starts spending $17 million in Generation Now and Partners for Progress, and the bill gets passed in July of 2020. And the
All right,
go ahead, yeah.
Let me interrupt you a second because I don't want to get too far into the weeds. Jake Zuckerman took a look at the massive amount of information that's come out so far. And the upshot was this is a really complicated scheme.
Yes.
There are tentacles everywhere. And how do you take everything you just said and make that understandable for a jury? This is complicated stuff, right?
Right. And it was a long story, and I had to read through it and kind of highlight places and take notes. But yeah, it does show all the interrelationships that went on and continued even through the repeal effort.
Juries like things simple. They like A to B to C. And the biggest challenge the prosecutors have, they've got the evidence. I mean, we've detailed the evidence, and it's pretty intense. But the challenge is, how do you make sure they get it? Because that Householder is going to be doing the opposite, making this as complicated as possible. Jake did a nice job putting it into perspective, but I think it demonstrates the difficulty of telling this story. We tell the story our way, but the prosecution has got to tell it in a way where they prove a crime.
Right. And I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. But anyway, defense attorney questions ahead of the cross-exam, because they will, the defense attorneys will now cross-examine Blaine Wetzel. And what they've asked during the prosecution's examination indicate that they will paint House Bill 6 as politics as usual and not bribery.
Well, we know a former politician who tried to claim politics as usual. Jimmy Damore is sitting in prison for 20 plus years. It didn't work with him. We'll see if it works here. Jake Zuckerman's story is on cleveland.com. It's Today in Ohio. We talk occasionally on this podcast about human trafficking. Reporter Caitlin Durbin wanted to do something that might help reduce it. By talking to victims, Layla, what did Caitlin report that might help some others?
Caitlin spoke with two survivors of human trafficking who had very different stories to tell and also guidance to offer that could help prevent future victimization. These are survivors who work with the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking, and they recently participated in a survivors panel in honor of Human Trafficking Prevention Month in January. One of the messages that they wanted to convey is that human trafficking takes many forms, and so it's really difficult to track or sometimes recognize. But make no mistake, it's definitely happening here in Northeast Ohio. Over the past 6 years, the Northeast Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, which is under the Cuyahoga County Sheriff, has rescued 241 victims and helped convict 57 traffickers. So one of the survivors told Caitlin that a family member repeatedly sold her to adult men for sex from the time she was 5 until she was removed from her home at age 17. And protective services were called to her home dozens of times. This is when she lived in North Carolina as a child. But even when she reported some of the abuse, help never came, and she eventually just stopped reporting. So today, she advocates for wraparound services like counseling for vulnerable kids, especially those who are heavily involved with DCFS, for example. And she says kids must be educated on safe and unsafe touch and also the concept of consent. And she says we need more safe spaces where kids can go to confide in trusted adults. And then there was another survivor who was attending college in Northeast Ohio when she came across an online ad for a modeling agency. And this agent was kind and took time to learn everything about her. And he later used those details to manipulate her into posing nude for him. And he ended up using those photos on a porn site where they were downloaded hundreds of times. And each time is a new victimization of her. And she feels that her experience could have been prevented if she had been taught about consent and online predators, or if others around her had been trained to recognize warning signs that she was being trafficked. And so these two stories are emblematic of just a couple kinds of human trafficking that we as a society need to be more aware of.
Yeah, the model example, I don't think a lot of people normally think of as trafficking, but if you think about the psychological trauma of knowing that those pictures will always be somewhere
Right.
on the World Wide Web, where for the rest of your life, your colleagues could find them and be sharing them. It's just, and she talked about that,
She did.
how traumatizing that is. You don't normally think about that when you think about trafficking, but this was a guy, his ad was for a model, and then he converted it into something that will be with her for the rest of her life.
Right.
The one in Carolina was disturbing. I mean, she said she was basically being raped every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and no one would listen to her, so she quit reporting it and just suffered in silence.
Right.
So,
And she described the physical symptoms that she, presented headaches daily and things like that, that if that sensitive adult in her life could have picked up on those signs and followed through. And, unfortunately they did not.
yeah, it was a very different perspective on the trafficking story. Well done by Caitlin Durbin. You're listening to Today in Ohio. At least someone is not willing to stand still while Ohio homeschoolers advocating racism and Nazi philosophy peddle their curricula to others. Laura, who's fighting back?
A California rabbi. This is Rabbi Abraham Cooper. He's the Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is based in Los Angeles. He's speaking out and saying the content is an attempt to indoctrinate children and that Ohio's elected leaders should intervene. And what we're talking about, I think we talked about this on the podcast last week, is Dissident Homeschool. This is a Telegram channel started in October of 2021, has 2,600 followers, and it distributes content that's racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, and factually inaccurate for homeschool families. And it was public when the story came out. They've since made it private, so we can't see it, what is inside it anymore, but really awful examples. And what Cooper's saying is what's particularly pernicious is that it's about the indoctrination of children, starting at an early age where you're bringing them into a culture of hate. And we don't know long range the impact. He just says, obviously, we know nothing good will come of it. And this group, it's LA based, but it is a leading Jewish human rights organization that has a national reach.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because you've got a free speech issue. If people want to be racist and homophobic and advocate Nazism, they're allowed to do that. What I think in the past has kind of forced that down is backlash, is people arguing, no, we need to be humanist and this is despicable stuff. This group seems more intent on getting the Ohio Department of Education to do something, and I'm not quite sure what they can do.
I'm not sure either. We don't have very strict homeschool laws in this state, very few laws. And actually, there's a Senate bill that would make it even less restrictive on homeschooling. So Ohio parents who teach their kids at home have to notify a local superintendent. They have to sign a form and provide an outline of their intended curriculum. But no one, not the state, not the local superintendent, verifies the curriculum is being used. And students aren't subject to standardized tests to prove they were educated. So the way that it's written in Ohio, these students are not held to the same standards that kids going to a public or, a public school are at all.
When I was a kid, you were required to go to school. The law was kids had to be educated. And it seems like Ohio has so relaxed the laws on homeschooling that there really isn't a requirement that they be educated anymore. If a parent wants to keep their kids ignorant, they can do it by claiming homeschooling, it appears.
That's a really scary thought, right? That these kids grow up to be adults who have to interact with the world, and they won't have the regular baseline of knowledge to interact with people. And if they're being indoctrinated in hate, are going to be super prejudiced against them, right? I mean, and who knows what they would do? What Cooper is saying is if you say over and over your neighbor is less of a human being or they're a threat, you're creating a cadre of young people who have an alternative reality of what's going on. That can be really dangerous.
But it's the basic philosophy. Do we as a community owe it to all children to ensure they're educated because we as a community believe that? Or does it completely up to the parents what they do with their kids? There was a time when I was a kid where it really wasn't up to the parent. Your kid went to school, and if they didn't, you were in trouble as well as they are.
As a society, we protect children. That's why we have DCFS, right? We don't let parents abuse their children just because they want to.
But Ohio is.
Right.
In this
case,
and
what Cooper's arguing is this is a form of child abuse.
Yeah. Well, by teaching your kids to advocate Nazism, you can make a strong argument for it. But Ohio is to blame for that because of its rules. Very interesting case. You're listening to Today in Ohio. Were comments by Cleveland's public safety director about Irish people in the police department racist? Lisa, I'm having a hard time understanding what the offense is here, and I'm Irish. Why did Kerry Howard apologize for what he said?
Well, because there was backlash from the police unions after a question that he answered. So Safety Director Kerry Howard last week was at a policing panel at the Warrensville Heights Word Church, but he was not on the panel. He was in the audience. But he was asked by somebody why Black people should consider a law enforcement career. And he said, well, I dismissed the behavioral assessment psychologist for recruits and replaced it with local all Black psychologists because he said there was race in the recruitment process. And he said after he, made these new hires, applicant diversity did increase. And then he went on and said, well, Irish were not considered white back in the day, which is true. They flooded police departments and fire departments, especially here in the northeast part of the country, to the point where we have bagpipes and kilts and all this green when we celebrate law enforcement. And he probably would have been okay. But then he went on and he said, racism is in America's DNA, and a certain type of person who has historically applied to be a law enforcement officer and we're not part of that certain type of person. So that's kind of walking the line there. But the Fraternal Order of Police President, Captain James O'Malley, whose Irish, policing goes back a few generations, he said that, he was bombarded by complaints from union members and civilians alike. Howard did call and apologize to him, and he said he was okay with that. But he said, he still said he was racist. And then the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association is actually calling for Howard's termination.
Yeah, I'm not buying this, right? I mean, Kerry Howard's right. For the longest time, police departments were pretty Irish and white, although kilts and bagpipes, not Irish, that's Scottish. And what he was trying to say was that we need to change that. We're trying to get the police department to reflect the people it polices. And that's been a long-standing goal. He was speaking the truth about what happened. I think what's really at heart here, Kerry Howard has been a disciplinarian. He has held police officers to account when they've done bad things, something his predecessors were not good about. And I think the union is grabbing onto this almost figment of racism to try and get him into trouble. Is anybody else buying this as a legitimate complaint?
I certainly am not, because, there is such a thing as stereotyping, but the line between stereotyping and racism can be very narrow sometimes. I think he fell on the right side, and he's not wrong. I mean, there's a tradition of Irish, law enforcement officers going back generations.
Well, he's also arguing that this is an entry point for people to become part of the mainstream. He said Irish were looked down upon. They got into police, they got these jobs, and they became more cemented as part of society. And he would like to see that happen with Black residents in Cleveland. I'm reading the story, trying to understand what he apologized for. Again, I'm Irish. I don't see anything offensive in what he said, except that, he said Irish people wear kilts, and I don't recall. All right. You're listening to Today in Ohio. All right, this next story was the most interesting story we published all weekend. Let's talk about the well-known Cleveland community anti-violence organizer who police threw in jail under the most questionable of circumstances. Layla, what's this case about? Where does it stand?
So we're talking about Antoine Tolbert. He leads an organization called New Era Cleveland. It stages civilian armed street patrols in the city's most crime-laden neighborhoods. And their goal is to deter violence and protect citizens. And they also offer resources and social service referrals. So Tolbert believes that citizens are better equipped than officers at preventing most crime. And although he generally accepts the role that police play, he does believe that if police aren't interested in partnering with groups like his, taxpayer money should be diverted elsewhere. I mean, in short, he's a violence interrupter who city council members call upon frequently to help out when tensions are running hot in a neighborhood. And most of the time, he does this simply by arriving with his team. He knows the streets and its players. He's very effective at quashing altercations before they escalate. So the event that gave rise to his arrest happened in May of last year. Tolbert heard about a shooting in the Glenville neighborhood. He had a pretty good idea of the groups that might be involved and where the vehicle and the description might be headed next. So he armed himself. He arrived. He parked in a parking lot of a nearby pharmacy. He was loading a shotgun. He had a handgun in a holster, and he put on a bulletproof vest. And a customer in that nearby pharmacy saw him in the parking lot loading his shotgun. And this customer called 911. This was just days after yet another mass shooting, and the caller was nervous. And Tolbert began walking down St. Clair Avenue with his shotgun while he was recording the whole thing on Instagram Live. Police then confronted him and told him folks were nervous about him walking around with a weapon. They asked him to drop it. He did comply, and he explained what he was doing. And the officer acknowledged that Ohio was an open carry state, and she allowed him to resume his march down the street. And he continued, and then another patrol car pulled in front of him. And this time an officer drew his weapon on him. And for 3 minutes, they shouted at each other. The officer telling him, "You can't walk down the street with a gun in your hand," when in fact, you actually can. And more cops arrived on the scene. Tolbert was pretty sure they might kill him, but he committed to standing his ground and asserting his rights until they arrested him, and he went peacefully without incident. So they charged him with improper handling of a firearm and inducing panic. The charges were dismissed by the next day, and Tolbert filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city and several officers. On February 1st, the parties finally reached a settlement, and this Tuesday, tomorrow, the city's Civilian Police Review Board is scheduled to consider his case and potentially make disciplinary recommendations for the 8 officers involved. This case is so interesting on so many levels. This is the one that I brought up to my husband, and we had a very lively discussion about it this morning. So I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Look, this is America today, right? And that anybody can walk down the street with a gun. 911 needs to be trained. If somebody calls and says, "I see a guy loading a shotgun," to say, are they doing anything threatening? Because they're allowed to. The people that wanted to elaborate on gun rights probably never envisioned Black people in the city carrying guns, because a lot of this is based in white supremacy nonsense.
But let me ask you, Chris, if you saw anyone loading a gun in a parking lot of a pharmacy, would you call 911?
No,
you would
this
not.
is America. These are the
rules.
rules.
All right, so then what is
right?
the threatening behavior that you have to wait for?
I think
Shooting?
he has to point it at somebody and threaten them.
Good Lord.
I would totally 100% Layla call 911 if I saw someone loading a shotgun in the parking lot of a pharmacy. Yes.
It's completely
I
legal.
understand.
I understand it's
America.
completely legal, but I would like the police to know this is a possibility of violence.
Let it be upon the cops to figure out if it's a threat. I mean, I understand the element of racism that's at play in this case.
Right.
I understand that. I'm saying any person loading a gun in a neighborhood is going to make me feel very upset enough to call the police.
Come on. We've seen loads of white people carrying guns
I would
openly
never.
in parks,
I would
in all
call the
sorts
cops
of
on
places.
anyone. If I were in a CVS and I saw anybody get out of their car in the parking lot and start loading a shotgun, I would be terrified.
Me too.
But they arrested him.
Right. I'm not saying they did the right
thing.
thing.
Wrong.
Yeah, their eventual. But I feel like on the front end, to call the police when you see someone loading a shotgun in broad daylight in a parking lot, that's terrifying.
That's not the story.
You said
you
wouldn't call the police, though, so I'm challenging you on that.
The police came, and he said, "I'm exercising my right," and they still took him down. You don't see this happening to white people openly carrying. No,
you're right.
You only see it happening to Black people openly carrying. They abused his rights. Look, you can argue that this is a really bad situation in America where anybody can walk around with any kind of weapon.
It is.
But that's where we are as a society,
it's
and
terrible.
It applies across the board. This guy was wronged in every way possible.
He was.
And the officers should be disciplined. They violated his rights.
Yeah. I mean, they investigated it and discovered that he was doing what he was doing was within his rights, and they arrested. Yes, they absolutely did. But so that's where the training needs to be is in the process of investigating these kinds of things. But we as a society are told when you see something, say something. And I would 100% call the cops on anybody loading a shotgun in public.
It's a great story by John Tucker.
It is.
Best read of the weekend, loaded with good detail, good fodder for conversation as we're having on Today in Ohio. We've talked plenty about how out of control East Cleveland police are, chasing people recklessly like drunken cowboys on the roads and getting indicted for crimes in hard to fathom numbers. How does the new chief plan to get this department back on track, Laura?
This is Brian Gerhard, and he is a long-time East Cleveland police officer. Born in East Cleveland, spent most of his career there. He did work security for CMHA before he began as auxiliary officer, but he's basically trying to right the department because it is, like you said, completely out of control. He replaced Scott Gardner, the chief, who was charged with theft in office. That's one of 9 department officers facing charges. 2 of them have admitted in court to taking a bribe while in uniform in front of the police station. Others are accused of fleecing and pummeling suspects. And then obviously we wrote a lot about all of the chases that were going on in East Cleveland, which were terrorizing the city, killed people. And so that is one of the things he has done. He's stopped the end of excessive chases. He's installed a new policy that says officers can only pursue drivers who are accused of felonies. So just because you have a taillight that's out doesn't mean you're going to be chased through the city anymore. He's raising the department's hiring standards because they've in the past accepted too many troubled officers from other departments. And he stressed he won't hire people if there are issues in the past. They're struggling to pay enough money for these officers. They have a starting wage of $17.27 an hour, which you can get paid more if you are a lifty at Boston Mills. So they're trying to increase the pay to $19.19 an hour with a $4,800 end of the year bonus.
But they have very little money in East Cleveland,
Right.
So it's hard to do. This is it's a laudable plan, but good luck. You've got a lot of rot in that department. The number of people they've abused is over the top. And unless you replace all these officers that have been running rogue, how do you really drum that attitude out of them? They treated people like dirt and just ran roughshod everywhere.
Right. And the mayor stood up for it. And the chief said they're keeping the city safe by not allowing scofflaws to go through. So, I mean, Gerhard and residents did not like this. It's not like they were on board. Gerhard said he's following state regulations to ensure that he and all the other officers, and we're talking about 40 officers, are up to date with recent state training and qualifications, because that was a problem in the past too. So that's a big step for residents. And you've got to give this guy credit. He's 60 years old. He wants to finish his career there. He doesn't have, plans for another department or career. He's from East Cleveland. He wants to fix East Cleveland. And I wish him luck.
Yeah, we wish him luck. You're listening to Today in Ohio. Where's the time gone? We're almost out of time. We got one more to talk about. How might a court ruling last week improve air quality despite Donald Trump's efforts near the end of his term? And Lisa, before we answer that question, I do want to point out it is really reprehensible that a former president of the United States was on a social media channel last night attacking the halftime show and Rihanna. What kind of former president does stupid stuff like that? Anyway, rant over.
Well, and his fingers were all over this. So Federal Circuit Judge Jane Stanch is ordering the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to reconsider a decision it made in 2020 to gut the air nuisance rule, which allows Ohio residents to bring suit against polluters they believe are endangering public health. And it was part of our state's compliance with the Federal Clean Air Act. So after the November 2020 election, the EPA rolled that back. This was under the Trump administration. They said they wanted to repeal it, saying it was an error correction from 50 years ago, which sidesteps the actual rulemaking process. But environmental groups and pollution victims sued. They say it unfairly blocked them from, getting relief from major polluters. Judge Stanch says the plaintiffs absolutely have standing, and the rule will remain while the EPA reconsiders their decision. But here's the rub. So the EPA overruled this policy after a request from attorneys for SunCoke Energy, which is a coke making plant in Ohio that was facing a citizen lawsuit for pollution. And then bingo, bango, bongo, they rolled back the rule.
Yeah, it is amazing how many people still support Donald Trump. I mean, here he is saying, let's poison the air, and people still support him. It's mind boggling. I hope this is successful. This is about keeping our air clear. They can go talk to people in East Palestine about what they think about having clean air, kind of an important thing. It's Today in Ohio. That does it for Monday. We didn't get to everything. We'll save something for tomorrow. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Layla. Thank you for listening.